Hey guys, this is Jay Calderon with Jay Unboxing, giving you some personal takes from this last weekend as well as looking forward to the fight weekend coming up. Not a lot of major fights this weekend happened for men, but we did have a junior middleweight unification bout between Claressa Shields and Marie-Eve Dicaire on Friday. This was on pay-per-view. It was an infamous ordeal online, of course, with people saying that it wasn't worth the money and others saying that we should support women's boxing. Of course, free market, buy what you want, but I actually thought it was a fairly decent card. Claressa Shields ended up putting in a solid performance over 10 rounds. Similar issue to Amanda Nunes, though, from UFC, I did notice, where she just seems to be so far and away better than everyone else in her division that it makes her almost look weaker as a whole, including the sport, because it just doesn't look like solid competition. I mean, she won in basic shutouts on all three cards, and it wasn't even questionable or close. She was the completely dominant fighter. And as a result of that, you just see her having a hard time proving her worth when there's not a lot of worthy competitions. Nonetheless, I think what she needs to focus on more than anything else is to continue to try to sell herself and just keep winning. It's not going to rub everyone the right way, and she's going to come across perhaps as a little bit arrogant or even sometimes a little bit self-absorbed or even a little bit off just in terms of her rating of herself. But that's better than other people not rating her at all, to me. And that's still the most important thing. So it can have ultimately that kind of Ronda Rousey effect, not to use so many different UFC comparisons here, where for many reasons Ronda Rousey was very sellable, but part of it became that she ultimately just started dominating people at such a high clip that you had to appreciate it. And ultimately what it ends up happening is that the competition gets better because you start to see that the sport and the female side of the sport is thriving. Claressa Shields can do that as she continues to win. What I think could help women's boxing, though, there are some things, and I kind of went back and forth with people on Twitter as the fights were happening, where you just don't see a lot of stoppages. And some people were suggesting that the rounds being 2 minutes were ultimately what stopped women from getting those stoppages. But I don't know if I necessarily think that that's always true. I mean, at the end of the day, you have a certain amount of time to stop people. And, you know, look at, again, a different sport, but look at something like UFC, where they have 5-minute frames and they don't, on the whole, get any more stoppages, later on in the rounds than they do earlier in the rounds. Ultimately, it depends, you strategize for the time that you're allotted, no matter what. I think, if anything, the 2-minute rounds keep the action shorter, and what it does is it gives viewers far less of an excuse to not watch, because those fights go fast. I mean, you're talking, including minutes in between rounds, you're talking less than a half hour for an entire bout. So you really get to pack all the action into a smaller, tighter window when, let's be frank, women's boxing, especially in the States, does not get a lot of airtime to begin with. What I do think could help, though, with the stoppages particularly, would be getting perhaps smaller gloves. Now, I know that seems perhaps more dangerous, but the truth is I think it's actually safer, and if you look at the entire women's side of the sport, it would actually do them better, I think, to do it that way. Because let's look at what you have to look at. You have to look at the fighter that could be hurt, the winning fighter, and how it could potentially impact them, and then you have to look at the fans, and then ultimately the sport. Well, the losing fighter is far less likely to take an extensive beating because she's more likely to be stopped, which may be counterintuitive for some, but when you're taking a single shot that knocks you out, it's far less damaging long-term to your brain especially, but in general for things like cuts in your nose and your jaw and whatever else it might be, it's far less damaging when you can get knocked out quicker, as weird as that sounds, than it is to have a big pillow-shaped glove just completely compress against the side of your head and almost certainly concuss you the more and more it cleanly hits you. And especially with women, it just seems that they have, whether it's, again, because of the size of gloves or not, I can't say that for certain, but for whatever reason, they just have a slightly harder time knocking their opponents out. So it just ends up getting to a point where a fighter like Claressa ends up becoming the clearly dominant figure of the two, and then just lands cleaner and cleaner and left Dakar getting hit with shots she shouldn't have been getting hit with. And with smaller gloves, I think she would have went down. You do have to factor in, what about the winning fighter here? What about Claressa? Is this going to put her in any more harm's way in terms of, hurting her hands? Because ultimately that is what gloves are supposed to be used for anyway. It's actually protecting the hands. Well, I don't think so. Again, as much as you might say she could have brittle hands, well, she could wear gloves that are more for fighters who need to protect their hands, like a winning pair as opposed to a Reyes, more of a puncher's glove. But also you could make an argument just as much that throwing your hands more is probably just as damaging as it is to throw it against less cushion, or with less cushion. So again, that's not really its fault there. The fans are protected here too, again, because you're getting more action, it's more beneficial to them. It's not something that's ultimately going to hurt the sport in that respect, and of course that then means the sport continues to grow. So everyone benefits from this, and I think it's something that should definitely be looked into. I know it's not something that should be taken lightly, of course, but at the end of the day, I think it's something that could potentially work. And the final thing I thought of were tournaments. I thought about professional tournaments because it's something that you could put on a sort of off Friday or Saturday where boxing doesn't have a lot on. You put the best of the very best in there. You're building potential stars, and again, you have fighters, and you can send at the Katie Taylors and the Claressa Shields of the sport, where you have some women fighters with names, and you can throw those opponents at them that you've built up into more promising and more potentially threatening opposition. But again, the sport is still growing, and hopefully it continues to do so, because quite frankly, I love all boxing. I'm just trying to watch more fights. Also on Thursday, just a little side note here, this was the day before the Claressa Shields fight. Ring City USA had a great fight card that saw Brandon Adams taking out the previously unbeaten Sergei Bohachuk in the 8th round. It was a very good fight, and it was back and forth in the beginning. Ultimately, Bohachuk seemed to take over the middle rounds, and then he got caught with a perfect left hand by Adams after it really kind of seemed like Adams had resigned himself to just surviving. But he, now to his credit, continued to throw with some serious intention and ultimately won. And it was a great fight, and you got the sense from the people involved that this is the intention of this kind of card. It's really these sort of crossroads or up and coming, almost like a secondary option to like a show box, where you're putting two fighters in there that aren't quite at the world level, but you're kind of trying to see where they are. Very competitive fights, and if they're going to continue to do that, that's something that we should definitely look at and appreciate as boxing fans, of course. Now, looking forward to this Saturday, we have the long-awaited rematch between 115-pound world champion Juan Francisco Estrada and fellow titleist Roman Chocolatito Gonzalez. You also have a couple of other world title fights on that same card. It's a triple header. It's a really good one. And then you have the return of former titleist David Benavidez taking on Ronald Ellis on a separate card, which will be aired on Showtime. Firstly, let's look at the loaded card headlined by Estrada-Gonzalez, which will be airing on DAZN. Now, this is a Junior Bantamweight World Championship clash, and it's mouthwatering. I mean, almost a decade in the making. When Gonzalez won a close decision back in 2012, it's now more relevant than ever. Rematches usually mean that the guy who won the first one does it again, but quicker, or that's at least a rule of thumb. It doesn't always go that way, of course. However, this is such an intriguing fight because their careers have so switched that it's almost you get the sense that Estrada's probably the favorite. He certainly is the betting favorite. And you had, on the one hand, in the first fight, Gonzalez sort of the guy that people were expecting to be the winner who was going to then move on and go on to bigger and better things. And while he remained undefeated, it was a close fight that left many wanting a rematch ultimately. And now, with Gonzalez having lost and having really had to rebound and ultimately win a title again, and with Estrada having beaten the guy who beat Gonzalez, as well as having looked really good in his last few fights, you have a complete switching of the roles, a reversal of those roles, and it makes for a very compelling fight that I happen to think is going to be, of course, an amazing contest. I mean, how could it not be? They're just too skilled. They like to fight on top of that. And then, of course, is that history of Estrada wanting to avenge what he thought was a fight he won, and Gonzalez wanting to prove that, no, in fact, he's the superior fighter. I mean, it has all the makings of a very, very good fight. And then you also have another rematch on that, and this is, of course, between Jessica McCaskill and Cecilia Brakas. Now, Jessica handed Cecilia her only defeat, and now they're going to run it back, but this time all the gold in the women's welterweight division's on the line. McCaskill has all governing body gold, and now based on ratings, the vacant World Championship by the Ring Magazine will also be on the line as well. In the opener, this is the opener of the card, mind you. You have junior flyweight champion Hiroto Hayaguchi taking on Alex Aragon Vega in the opener. Hiroto is a very solid special talent and should be fun to watch as well. I don't know a tremendous deal of his opponent, to be perfectly honest with you, but Hiroto himself is a very solid fighter. You should go watch some clips of him against Heki Butler. He did really well, and it's a very, very good fight, especially for an opener. Then you have the Benavidez Ellis fight. And as far as that's concerned, it's an interesting matchup. I actually really like it. It should be a decent test for Benavidez, especially with him coming back from having been stripped of his title for failing a drug test and having to have gone through his suspension. Ellis is solid. That's what you can say about him. And if David is able to make it look like he's in control and the boss of that fight, then he might have a shot at making some more noise at 168 pounds and facing the likes of Plant or Canelo or whomever else might come into the picture. But he needs to deal with Ellis and do it comfortably, because if he's off or overlooking Ronald, or Ellis just happens to be a bad matchup for Benavidez, it's not going to make him look good. It has a potential, all the properties there in place to really make him look bad, winning or losing being kind of inconsequential there. So that should be an interesting fight itself. And as far as who I think will win or lose, I will have some predictions for the Benavidez Ellis fight coming out later this week. I also will be taking a look at Estrada versus Gonzalez, of course, on Saturday. So, yeah, be sure to look for those. And also be sure to like, comment, share, subscribe, and follow. Appreciate all the support whenever I do get it. Follow on Twitter at jcalderon_JOB. Of course, you can email me at jonboxing@gmail.com. You can also visit jonboxing.com for the schedule, betting odds, results, rankings, and more. And as always, until next time.